Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
What a nice crowd. What a nice occasion that is a conversation among people with varying views about an issue that's really hard. Right? So your very compelling introduction reminding us of what's happening right now in the Philippines. It's 10,000 people dead. And I'm told, I don't know what the numbers of people who have lost their homes, have lost the integrity of their bodies, and have suffered many other ways. That's one instance of suffering. It's our most currently visible one, but there are many others. If we're here to talk about suffering and its significance, what we can learn from it, how we think it is caused or allowed to happen, what the theological explanations of the presence of suffering in a world that is, in Christian teaching, a world created by a God who is omniscient, means he knows everything, omnipotent, can do anything, and perfectly good. Those are the three parts of the conception of God in Christian faith. And of course, it yields this problem. Now, I know you've all thought about this, so this isn't a new problem, but it's the problem we're here to think through. How, in a world that is created under this teaching, and under different stripes of Christian faith, either set in motion by or continually managed by, or in some conceptions micromanaged by this God who is both all-powerful, is all three of all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. How can there be 10,000 people in the Philippines right this minute who are dead as the result of a natural storm, a typhoon, that swept through and killed these people just like that, right? How can that be, if that's the kind of world, if that's the nature of this world? So there are many theodicies for this problem. This is known as the problem of evil, or sometimes called the problem of suffering. Philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics and the history of Western thought or Christian thought in general has developed a great number of ways of trying to address this problem. So some of the ways that suffering is viewed, and this is a particularly incomplete list, it would take us a very long time to think through all of them. Traditional Christian views of suffering, though, include the view that suffering is a punishment. It's a punishment for bad action, for wrongdoing, for misbehavior of a whole variety of sorts. Or suffering is a punishment for non-belief or inadequate belief or a defamation of belief and a variety of infractions of that sort. So suffering as a punishment. Or suffering, these are what are known as theodicies, and there are a great many more than these. Suffering is a precondition for entrance into heaven. So suffering that occurs in this life has an effect on one's capacity to or eligibility for the greater eternal reward that in Christian thought comes afterwards. But suffering is sometimes said to be a precondition, or at least something that, so to speak, enhances raises one's chances of entering into heaven. Right? So, as with the previous theodicy, there are many, many stripes of this view, but it's important to keep it in mind. Or here's the third. Suffering's an instrument for the enlightenment or edification or to enhance, sharpen the capacities for compassion on the part of other people. So your suffering makes other people better. It makes you better. It makes other people better. And while suffering isn't in itself a good thing, its consequences for the moral capacity of human life are so enormous that we have to think of it as appropriate. So those are just three of the many ways that Christian thought, or the examination of Christian thought, has dealt with the problem of suffering. And that's what we're here to talk about. Now, before I close this little introductory thought, it's well to remember that there are many kinds of suffering. So I thought I'd just ask you, the audience, so we warm up a little bit. We've had one extraordinary example of human suffering, but can you give me a few more? Anybody over in this area aware of or currently in contact with or knows in the past of any instance of suffering? Betrayal. And betrayal is suffering for the person who is betrayed, right? And may involve suffering for the betrayer as well, but betrayal is a harm, and it's actually not often cited in the usual lists of suffering, so nice example. Anybody else over here? No suffering? Yes? Come on, I don't believe for a minute. It's a nice young crowd generally, but I think you've seen a few things around, yeah? I'm sorry? Disease. Any particular disease or diseases in general?
I suffer from
Chronic back pain. So do I. You know, we have that in common, right? So that's suffering, and it fluctuates a little bit, right? Some days it's worse, sometimes it's better. In fact, studies show that in a crowd like this, a substantial proportion of people will have back pain, even stuff that doesn't show up on x-rays, right? But nice example. It's typically a private suffering. You don't go around the world announcing it. Right? It's something that we don't notice, and it's not as visible as the 10,000 dead in the Philippines, but there it is. Nice example. How about over on that side? Any examples of suffering? War. Got any particular wars in mind? Or all of them, right? In the entire history of the human race, right? From, early hominids throwing clubs at each other, or whatever it is they did, right? All the way up through the history of war is way too long to even mention a few, although we could, of course, cite any of the huge major wars, little tiny wars. They all involve suffering, right? And they involve suffering of combatants and non-combatants, right? Increasingly, it's the non-combatants who are the more frequent victims of sufferers from war in comparison to the combatants. But that's the picture. Any examples from the middle?
Defeat.
Sorry?
Defeat.
Defeat. So being defeated in any enterprise? War, betrayal. So if you flunk a math exam, is that defeat? Yes? Well, we just want to get a bead on what suffering is, yeah? Aging. Aging has its challenges. That's certainly true. So we'll put that on the list. Now, aging itself might not count as suffering, but the things that go with it. So changes in mobility, changes in intellectual capacity, changes in social connections, and so on. All that would count, right? Aging that leads to death. Well, all aging leads to death. And in fact, so not everybody, of course, well, you get the point, right? Death. We typically think of death as either suffering or associated with suffering. We live in an era in which the medical institutions that we have work to ameliorate or lighten the suffering that is associated with getting towards death, right? But of course, that doesn't change the fact of death itself. Yes?
Suffering from human selfishness
Oh, human selfishness.
and being affected by others' selfishness.
Yeah. Well, you can see that if we kept this up for a while, and I think our 7 minutes are getting close to up, we would have a very ample catalog of kinds of suffering, both from what seems small and inconspicuous, that is a case of back pain. It isn't inconspicuous to the haver of it, right? Just to the rest of us, to these huge global kinds of pains of suffering. And we normally divide them in discussing these issues, into natural evils, so earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, typhoons, all of the things. Human evils, so examples frequently cited are the Holocaust, Hiroshima, Rwanda, Cambodia, events like this. These are all sort of large-scale things. And things that have components of both. I think the near total extermination by the Europeans of New World Native Americans that involved both deliberate cruelty but also the bringing of diseases that wiped out populations counts as an interesting fusion of natural evil and human evil. You mentioned the destruction of the rainforest that produces starvation as an example of fused natural evil and human evil. And we could categorize everything here. Deceit would be a human evil, right? Back pain, it depends on how this back pain came into being, but it might be, as it were, a natural evil not caused by human intention or deliberate activity, or it might be, who knows, too much yoga? Something like that. What? Not enough yoga. There we go. Anyway, you see the point that when we're talking about the problem of suffering, we have a variety of kinds, and all the things that are still in your head as examples, please keep them there as we think through this problem of suffering. Thank you for coming here. We hope not to argue, but to try to illuminate this issue.
Thank you, Professor Battin. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, some people think that going to a maths lecture is suffering. I am deeply honoured to be invited to this university for the first time in my life. But it is a particular honour to be invited to speak in the distinguished company of Dr. Battin. And there's a very good reason for that. Our topic tonight is not for her a topic that's distant and philosophical. It comes right home, because many of you will know that she lost her husband of many years in very difficult circumstances just a few months ago. And I stand here deeply moved that she would be prepared to come into public with me and discuss a topic that is so personally close to her heart. This is a hard problem for all of us, actually. Anybody that thinks that the problems of suffering and pain, as they've been defined to us this evening, are easy, doesn't really understand. And as Dr. Battin has pointed out, There are two perspectives. There's the perspective of someone watching the suffering. Cancer looks very different to a professor of cancer surgery and to a young mother of 30 who's just been told she's got 1 month to live. There's an inside and there's an outside to the question. And it's so easy to lose that pastoral perspective and try to solve these problems in some kind of dispassionate way. There is no solution in the sense of a neat philosophical formula that can deal with it, because we live in a broken and a ragged world. I've been asked to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'll keep that very brief. I come from Northern Ireland, which is a sectarian and has been a violent country. I mention that to explain that my parents, though Christian, were not sectarian. And as a result of that, my father insisted on employing people from both sides of the religious community. For that, we were bombed. And my brother nearly lost his life in a bomb that blew up his face and left him in intensive care for a very long time. So terrorism has hit home. He didn't lose his faith in God. But we've heard about the Philippines, and it goes to our hearts. I've stood and wept in Auschwitz many times, ladies and gentlemen. I have many friends who lost all their relatives in those places. I arrived in Christchurch 2 days after the earthquake and had to meet women who'd lost their husbands, men who'd lost their wives, people who'd lost their children. And every one of them comes and says, why? And I have no simplistic answer to that. But I do believe that there is a way into it. As I say, I'm a Christian, and in a sense that creates the problem. Because if I react to Auschwitz, as many of my colleagues, and I understand them, if I react to Auschwitz by embracing atheism, well, that in a way partly solves the problem intellectually, because I now have the universe as a brute fact. I have to face it as it is, and that's just how it is. But you see, there are two routes now from this. One is philosophical. And as you know, some of you, I've debated Richard Dawkins, and he is one of the very influential people these days. And his view of naturalism leads him to deduce that there's no good or no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to his music. So in one fell stroke, he's abolished morality. And what I find very odd about that position, which is extreme, of course, is that he has a moral outrage like the rest of us as suffering. But if you don't believe that good and evil exists, that does not seem to me to be a logical position. We could explore that. It's a deep question that was raised in a way by Dostoevsky. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean, of course, that atheists couldn't behave well. I find sometimes my atheist friends shame me morally and ethically. From where I sit, of course, that is explained by the fact that all men and women are moral beings created in the image of God, whether they believe in him or not. And that's very important to me, each of us with that infinite value, because my worldview teaches me that there is a creator God who created and sustains the universe, but more particularly, you in it are made in his image. And it's that presents us with a problem. Why is it so many image bearers of God are dying in our world today? But as I say, if we go to atheism because of it, we have a philosophical problem, but we have another problem as well, because the suffering is still there. We haven't got rid of it. But we have got rid of all hope. Because those that are dead through no fault of their own, since there is no other world, there is no hope of compensation ever, or of fairness. And I understand that this is one of the questions that came to the organizers from this university. Why is life so unfair? We have all built in this sense of unfairness. Now, think about it. If there is no ultimate assessment, if there is no final judgment, if I might put it that way, then our sense of fairness will turn out ultimately to have proved to be an illusion. I don't believe it's an illusion. So what's the way in? Well, very briefly, and we're going to explore it, and we've no better guide to explore it than Peggy here, with her experience, not only personal, but her experience of thinking about these things for a lifetime and trying to make sense and help people come to terms with these huge issues. But let me put it simply like this. She mentioned the famous statement of Epicurus, and David Hume seized on it. If God is good, all powerful, how can we possibly believe that in light of the suffering? Well, the idea that comes up in our minds immediately is, could God, if he's omnipotent, not have made a world in which this kind of thing was impossible? My answer to that is, ladies and gentlemen, he could, of course. We have invented such worlds. They are the worlds of robotics and automata. A robot does what it's programmed to do. It has no moral sense because it has no moral categories, but for the simple reason that it has no capacity to choose. Now, you see, it seems to me that one way in, a theodicy, as we call it, is the one that I found most helpful. It doesn't solve everything, but at least gives us a way of thinking. That God has created beings in his image with the capacity to say yes, which implies the capacity to say no. In order to have a moral universe, you must have that freedom to choose. In order to have that love, you must have freedom to choose. So in one sense, God took an immense risk in bringing human beings into existence. But you know all about that, you parents. You do exactly the same thing. I've got 3 children, 7 grandchildren. As I held my first child, I remember thinking, this child could grow up to reject me. Was that a reason for not having children? No. And we can begin to understand by extrapolating upwards that in the very nature of things, if you're going to have conferred on you the dignity of choice and the capacity of love, then inevitably there arises the possibility that there will be suffering. And people who wish it otherwise are actually wishing themselves out of existence. So we're faced with this dilemma. Atheism partly solves the problem by saying that's just how it is. But it doesn't solve the problem at all because it leaves the suffering and it removes any hope. And of course, it's here finally, that the nature of God is so important for me. The possibility of God, as they call it technically in philosophy, that is that God suffers. The loud absence, where is God in suffering? Right in the middle of it, ladies and gentlemen. Because at the heart of Christianity there is a cross. And Nietzsche mocked the idea, what's this God who's on a cross? But taking it seriously, I ask myself this question. It shows us, at the least, that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has become himself part of it. Now, in my pastoral experience, I act as a chaplain at my college. I find that bringing that to people often is a way of opening up some possibilities. You see, if Christianity ended with the death of Jesus, I wouldn't be standing here. But because he rose from the dead, it's evidence for me that there is to be a judgment, and he's to be a judge. And he will do it utterly fairly because he is the person that's given his life for humanity. So my final point is this. We can argue to infinity. Surely a good God could, might, etc. And we'll never solve that question. So I ask a different question. I say I look at the world and I see very ragged edges. I see some beauty and I see some horror. It's like Coventry Cathedral. Evidence of bombing and evidence of a former beauty. And I say, is there anywhere in the universe evidence on the basis of which I can trust God with that? And I think part of that evidence, the biggest part of it, is the person of God as revealed in what Jesus has done. He has suffered. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So now the question for us is how we're going to make a conversation out of this, right? You've heard an extremely effective presentation of one individual's commitments and view and deep faith. And I have, especially after enjoying dinner just now with John, have no reason to doubt that this is genuine and deeply felt and the product of long experience. But of course, that doesn't answer all our questions, right? So one thing I think that we might do is consider what weight your own commitments, which are shared by some of the people here, but not all of them, have for those who don't share the antecedent commitment. So we can think about that. Here's an example. We can pick through various arguments. We can say things like, well, wait a minute, the fact that we need justice or need hope or need some sense of fairness and recompense for sufferings incurred, that we need them doesn't entail that they will happen or will occur either now or in the future. Yes, we might need hope, but that doesn't mean we actually can have well-founded hope. So we can have that kind of back and forth conversation, and then the people who have a faith that engenders hope are able to say to people who don't, look, this kind of hope is really important. It's part of what it is to be human. But of course, the people on the other side will say, well, wait a minute. It's hope, but it's not real. It's false. It's misleading. And part of what it is to be human is to live in a world without hope. Right? That doesn't mean bad things always happen. Sometimes good things happen, but it is a fabricated hope, a false hope that you're speaking of. So we have those two sides of an issue, and it seems to me that a conclusion we might draw from it is that both of those two things, even though they are inconsistent in their background metaphysics and theology, are really both part of human experience. Hope, and the importance of hope, and also the capacity to live in a situation in which there doesn't appear to be hope. Hope is unrealistic. So, I'd like to have it both ways, John, right?
Well,
your way and my way, right?
If you want it both ways, Peggy, you're almost qualified to be an Irish woman. Well, Peggy's raised a couple of very important points here, and I think she's hinting a little bit at Sigmund Freud, really, that a need for hope and a need for justice, of course, in themselves do not prove that they exist. And it's important that we deal with that kind of thing, because it raises the question, is the hope evidence-based or not? Is there any evidence that this is justified? So that's the first point. Of course, it's interesting. C.S. Lewis makes the point on this very issue. He says, it would, however, be strange if thirst existed in a world where there was no such thing as water. In other words, the desire for justice and hope and so on, it does raise the question where it's coming from. And I would want to argue, of course, that fitting it into the very much bigger worldview of Christianity makes sense. But I take Margaret's point because I would want to say that my faith in God is evidence-based. And in fact, that was the heart of the message of the early Christians. We are born again unto a living hope by what? The resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So they pinned their faith on a historical event and subsequent experiences of the risen Christ. So it's a question of evidence-based. The Freudian argument, unfortunately, works both ways. If I might just recount a slightly amusing incident. Stephen Hawking was interviewed by one of our papers, And he was asked about religion, and he said religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And that's the good Freudian argument. So I was asked by the Times to reply. I said, do you want a one-liner? So I thought hard, and I said, well, you can write this. Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, the point is that proves nothing.
Neither one of them.
It proves nothing. But the argument is double-edged, and I'm sure Peggy would recognize that. And I think it's important to explore. Hinting in the other direction, if I might just say one more thing, Peggy. I, as I've said now, believe that all men and women are made in the image of God. And that is an explanation of why there's such a common morality around. But many of my colleagues don't believe that, but the morality is there. Right. So that we can start there with that common thing.
Let's do it. So
we can certainly do that.
So we could start by thinking about it this way. So you said humans are made in the image of God. Good enough. This is, core religious Christian belief. But we could also say that the image of God is made by idealizing humans. That is, we take humans, look at the variety of humans with foibles and imperfections, and we can imagine how individual humans could be better, how they could be a lot better. They could be way, way better. They could be stronger. They could be more knowing. They could be, especially importantly, way better morally. That is, they could be good. And so we extend our imagination from the actual humans we see into an image of God, right? We create an image of God that is derived from our sense of human limitation and the capacity to go beyond that. So those are two ways of tapping into moral, the importance of moral sentiment. You won't like that second version.
Oh,
I
like
the first
it, but
version. But
I go along there a little bit.
Oh, yeah?
But it's just, I would add another sentence.
A little bit?
I would say, of course, for instance, I had a father. He was a wonderful father. Mm-hmm. I have friends who've had an utterly rotten experience of father. And so when it comes to God, they find it very difficult to conceive of God as a father. So, of course, we will idealize our own experience and project it up. The only thing I would say is, the real question is, is there an objective reality, God, who made us in his own image, which to my mind is a separate question. So I want this one both ways too.
All right. Can anybody help us with this particular question? Anything you want to add to this? No? Just before we move away from this point? Because this is an important point, yeah?
So your comment was that we have this idea of God that we've created like the very, very best of who humankind could be.
Right.
The interesting thing is that this Christian view of God is that he is a suffering God.
Ah.
So why would we invent a God who humbles himself and suffers for the people that have betrayed him?
So, nice question. Now, of course, in the Christian theology, there is God and there is the Son of God, also referred to as, and it's the Son of God, that is Jesus, who is the one who electively suffers, right? He, in a word, volunteers to do that. So that helps us see something about this discussion of suffering that we might not want to include in the catalog of the horrors of suffering that is actually voluntarily assumed, right? Now, people who are killed in typhoons are not doing that, we assume, voluntarily. People who are killed in wars went to war to defend whatever nation they're part of, but it isn't that the suffering and death that may be involved. That's not the elected part. It's the defense of country that's the elected part.
Could I just make
Yeah.
a little response to this? You've hit on something, I haven't heard it for a long time actually, that played a significant role in my commitment to Christianity. It was a book written by a man called Otto Borchardt, years ago, perhaps a century ago, called The Original Jesus. And the point he made was this: no one could have invented Jesus because he didn't fit in to any ideal of the hero or whatever of the ancient world. And it's still worth a read today, and it's making exactly your point. And I find it extremely important. This idea of a God who suffered and rise again, as the New Testament points out, is absurd if it's not true. So it brings that reality dimension into this whole thing. Thank you.
Here's another thing we could talk about. So, what's posited before this audience is the notion of a God who has the three characteristics we were outlining, but central among which is not just merely omnipotence or omniscience, but perfect goodness. Right? This is identified as the Christian God. Is it the exclusively Christian God, or is any conception of God much like this? Right? Is there something about the notion of God in any tradition that includes this? Well, you'll say, no, right? The God of the ancient Jews was good, but not benevolent and kind, right? It was fair and just, but not the warm, fuzzy New Testament God. Or the gods of the ancient Greeks were quite partial and rather vindictive in their interactions with each other. Or the God of this tradition is like this, the God of, that. Is there something about the nature of God, or is there something distinctive about the Christian God that we need to consider in our thinking about suffering?
Well, I would have thought so, but I disagree a little bit about your distinction between the old and the new. I do believe the God of the Bible is the same God throughout. And sometimes it's easy to forget that it's the Old Testament that tells us about God being gracious and merciful and so on. Those characteristics of God that are unpacked much more fully in the New Testament appear in the Old. And
along with ordering the killing of populations and individuals.
That is a question I'm very happy to go into.
Okay.
It may be something that...
Well, because it's relevant to suffering.
Oh, it's highly
right?
relevant. Mm-hmm. And the very interesting thing is, this is actually a big topic, and we could easily spend a whole evening on it. But let me just say one or 2 points, if I may, Peggy, on it. Often it's said that this is awful genocide, ethnic cleansing by Joshua when he came into the promised land and so on. The very interesting thing is this. The descriptions of that event occur in the biblical book of Deuteronomy, in which you'll find the very moral standards which we use to criticize that event. It doesn't occur in some obscure part of the Bible. It occurs at the heart of the Old Testament teaching on morality. I repeat, the very thing we use to criticize it is there. Secondly, the first known rules of war that are humanitarian are found in that book. As Lord Sachs, our chief rabbi, has pointed out, how they should be careful with women and children, not destroy the plants and so on. So when you read all of those things and discover this event, you realize you're dealing with something utterly exceptional. The next point is this, that the reason given why Deuteronomy is not embarrassed to put an event like that in a book full of very strong positive morality is that the analysis, at least the biblical analysis, and to be fair to it, we must listen to it, even if we disagree with it, is that it was a result of extreme moral evil among the Canaanites. And in fact, God had waited 400 years so that until, as it says, the iniquity, the absolute horrific child sacrifice and everything else. And so the judgment was, according to the Bible, whatever you make of it, actually a judgment of God for extreme moral evil. Now, of course, that question is raised by every instance of moral evil we have had tonight. The next point is that the Israelites were not going in as a superior nation to ethnically cleanse. They were told if they behaved the same way, they would receive the same punishment, which they actually did. There was to be no moral superiority whatsoever. And the final point is the work of recent scholars such as Nicholas Wolterstorff, I think he's at Yale or Harvard, analyzing these strange statements which are repeated frequently, 10 of them, I think, in one chapter formulaically, that you're to destroy them all, destroy them all, destroy them all. And he's done a lot of research on that because looking at the biblical history, the fact is they weren't all destroyed. They just weren't all destroyed. And his conclusion is that this was an ancient formula, a bit like if I said all of London came to the funeral of Princess Diana. Well, a whole lot of people were sick in bed with flu. Not all London came to that funeral. So that what Wolterstorff says is, as he reads the whole text, he comes to the conclusion that those commands mean score a decisive victory, and they did not damage the humanitarian rules of war that Deuteronomy states, so that the whole thing, Deuteronomy is not embarrassed at having that text there. So I think we can begin to see that it's a little bit more sophisticated than we might imagine.
And so, if I understand the claim that's being made here, that from a text which appears contradictory on its surface, and appears indeed even immoral on its surface, there is a deeper underlying morality that suffuses this entire context.
Yes, but it still leaves a big problem, as you know. And the big problem is the one I tried to address at the beginning. Our difficulty, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is we don't like the concept of judgment at any level. We just don't like it, if we're honest. And yet, if there's no such thing as judgment, even at the lower levels, you'd have no police force, you'd have nothing. And we know that there would be complete chaos. If you don't believe that, read what happened when the lights went out in New York in about 1970. That's a very interesting story. And I come back again to the fact that God, if God is the kind of God that has revealed himself in Christ as the God who suffers and offers peace and forgiveness and salvation, I see enough evidence in that to trust him with an utterly fair judgment, that if we saw it, we would say that's exactly right. In other words, I firmly believe that people that suffered innocently, there will be a compensation. But if you take an atheist worldview, there's no possibility of that whatsoever. That's out. So all you can do is a very good thing. And I was discussing this with Michael Shermer last night. He said, let's work for justice in this world so it doesn't happen again. And I say, absolutely. But if that justice is not backed up by an ultimate justice, the multi-millions who have not benefited from the justice that our generation works for will never see fair justice.
Which, of course, doesn't prove that there will be ultimate justice.
No, it doesn't, but it doesn't prove it won't happen.
Well, right. So you can make up whatever conjectures you like, but the fact that
you have to ask, I think, Peggy, what is the evidence?
Yes, okay,
I'm a
that's
scientist,
what we're
I'm
working
afraid.
Well, we're also,
It brings me back to the whole question of what the evidence of the truth of Jesus claim. Actually, the thing all comes back to that.
Well,
Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Let's try something about
yes, please,
the Jesus
do
stuff.
that.
Right, not to be irreverent, but it's important to see that there are parallels. So you movingly described the self-sacrifice of Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
Which is elective, voluntary, motivated by respect for and obedience to and love of God.
Yes,
right?
Surely.
We can describe it in many ways, but it's identified as primarily a sacrifice for humanity. Jesus died for our sins, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, some other people die for the good of humanity. For instance, we were talking about soldiers. Soldiers in a just war, or what's perceived as a just war, die for the good of humanity. There are some other, we can develop many examples. There are some kind of bizarre ones. For instance, Aztec volunteers for heart sacrifice. The Aztecs used heart sacrifice. They believed that sacrifice of the living, beating human heart was required to keep the sun in its track. And they knew, of course, that all growth and development of agriculture and human life generally was dependent on the sun, right? Not all of the Aztecs who were submitted to heart sacrifice were volunteers. In fact, many of them weren't, but some of them were, right? What about Islamic jihadists? These are people, although we call them by unflattering names, are people who sacrifice their lives for what they perceive to be the good of their community. What about the pilot who crashes his plane to avoid hitting the crowded schoolyard? Classic example from moral theory. What about the Buddhist monks and nuns who self-immolate to protest political regimes that are repressive? What about Shmuel Ziegelboim, the leader of the Polish government in exile, who immolated himself on the steps of Parliament, I believe, in order to try to get the world to respond to the extermination of the Polish Jews? Right? There are people in this world, in the past, in the present, no doubt in the future, who also make a sacrifice of themselves for the good of humanity. Right? Does that possibility influence what we see, what we think about the story of Jesus? Is Jesus simply the best example, the most, the biggest example, the most famous example, the star quality example of something that other human beings are also capable of? Or is it something different in kind? So it seems to me that one thing that this Jesus story does is get us to look at human behavior generally. What are these things of enormous nobility and selflessness that regular people are capable of? That seems to me to be the important thing about the Jesus story, not just that there was this event and it had supernatural characteristics.
I entirely agree with you.
Oh, you can't.
It's like, but let me just respond to that sequence of questions. I think it's like an eagle. It requires two wings to fly and not just one. And that you're putting a very important side of the question. So let me think if I could just come down your chain a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I agree with, I think, every point you made in it except one. Because I think, unless you were talking about something different from what I thought you were, I think Islamic jihadists who kill themselves, the purpose of doing that is to kill as many others as possible. And that makes it rather different from the examples of self-sacrificing people who've died in the place of others or died to rescue them and so on. But I do agree with you, and of course that is something that you find is part of Christianity, that Paul, the great apostle, as an example, talked about himself experiencing the kind of suffering at one level that Jesus suffered, persecution, rejection, and so on. But your final point, I would emphasize, yes, there are those parallels, and they're very important even practically. You know, as you know, Peggy, I do these debates. Yes. And people say...
By the way, you can watch them yourselves. There are many of them online, yeah. Right? Go to veritas.org, and you will find, John,
don't tell them too much.
Wonderful series of debates, right?
But the point is, I get letters. Why didn't you hang him? Why didn't you throttle him? Why didn't you... Why don't I? Because of Jesus' attitude to people. He didn't do that to people. And it's that, and that projected when you get a little bit of suffering of whatever kind, the private kind or the public kind. I go back to the fact that, well, here, half a minute, I may be suffering a little bit here. But what did Jesus do? There's all of that. But there's the other side, and that is the uniqueness. None of the people you mentioned died for the sins of the world. That is the unique thing, and he's only qualified to do that because he's God incarnate. That's the unique bit. But I accept the other bit. So the proverbial Irishman again, I want it both ways.
All right.
Does that make sense to you?
Well,
is that fair,
yes,
do you think?
Yes and no. I see the point, of course, that you're trying to develop, that there is something unique and special about these figures, especially Jesus, in Christian thought, that there's something particularly extraordinary. And what I'm trying to do is draw out from you the things that are important about those figures in a religious context to see what application they have, what relevance they have for us.
Right, I see it more
mortals,
clearly.
right?
Let me give you an example.
Okay.
Let me give you an example.
Yep.
In my university, I meet students who've just lost a parent.
Yeah.
And they're really suffering.
Right.
And you find this split into two sorts. There are those who are emotionally just overcome. And if you sat there and argued with them, you'd hurt them even worse. What they need is an arm around the shoulders, a sympathetic, a listening, not saying much. And you know this as well as I do. There are others who are asking the big questions, even as the pain hits them. And bringing that back, because you were referring it to Jesus, I learned that difference from thinking about the famous confrontation or discussion between Jesus and Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, in a graveyard in Bethany, where Jesus had let the man die, according to the story. It says he loved him and he let him die, which actually brings us very much into this sphere of suffering. How could the Lord love someone and let them die? And the sisters were slightly angry. Martha was the intellectual, and she said, look, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. You should have been here, and you let him die. And he said, your brother will live again. Oh, she said, I know. And they started a theological discussion with her brother lying in a grave a few meters away. The other sister was Mary. She stood weeping. And I think one of the most dramatic moments in the New Testament where Jesus stands beside her and he weeps too. And that shows me the different kinds of reactions. Some people need the intellectual response, the sorting out. Other people need the empathy, the sympathy, the weeping. And life does that to us. And I see that reflected there as a very practical example.
Right. It's a nice practical example because it is so universal.
Yes.
That arm around the shoulder, the weeping with someone who has been bereaved. So the point is, do you really need a theological model for that? Or does the theological model, which we may respect, actually show us what's important about human life? This is what counts, is the capacity to share the experience of grief in another person. Right?
Well, let me answer that. Do I need a theological model to do that? No, I don't.
No.
But the point is,
So we can't
the
claim-
theological issues are not settled by need or not need. They're settled by how does this fit into the bigger picture.
Wait a minute,
And
I thought we needed both.
I think that it's important to ask the bigger questions. Can I, once the weeping has stopped, can I really bring real hope? And that's where the worldview comes in. I mean, let's put it this way. If I'm in trouble, I have atheist friends who would come and put their arms around me. And boy, would I appreciate it. But they don't have, I feel, an ultimate answer. They've got a temporary way of helping. But there's not that bigger picture. And
If you put your arms around them, is that a temporary help or a bigger answer?
well, it could be both. because it could mean that they start asking questions about my worldview and so on and so forth. Or it might not be. And I've done it. So it works either ways. I don't do it with an ulterior motive, in other words.
Right.
The point is, I think you're emphasizing, and I sense this, that you're a very human person. And you sense these things very deeply, the importance of our common humanity and responding to each other and our sufferings and our problems at that level. And I'm absolutely with you. What I'm saying is, for those day-to-day interactions, we don't necessarily need to have a bigger picture. But once we start asking the more ultimate questions, we do need that bigger picture. Let me give you an analogy.
If it turns out the way you want, right? We might ask the bigger questions, and the answer is...
I'm not worried whether it turns out the way I want or not, actually. Yeah. Because I grew up in this Christian background, one thing I haven't explained tonight, which might help you understand where I'm coming about. When I got to Cambridge in my first week, a student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I should never have asked you that question. You're Irish, and all you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it." And you see, I'd heard that before, but I took it so seriously, it completely changed my life. I thought, could it be true that it's simply Irish genetics? After all, my parents Christian, my grandparents and their parents. It's just Irish genetics. So what I deliberately did on that day was search to find my first agnostic or atheist. And I've been befriending people who do not share my worldview ever since. Now, why do I do it? Because I'm not interested in anything less than what is true. What is the truth about this? Whether I feel a need for this or not a need for it. I could be sitting on a beach enjoying the sun and feeling a need of nothing. You're up on the cliff and see the sea encircles me. My feelings don't reflect my situation. And so all of us have a worldview into which we fit these big questions. And I'm a Christian because I have come to the conclusion through my life that it makes the most sense and gives me the biggest picture into which to fit that. But at the lower levels, I agree with you. Otherwise, we'd be saying an atheist couldn't show sympathy and so on. That's nonsense.
Yeah. We won't grant the notion of higher and lower levels. That is why, another way to put it is, let me change the question. Does 20 minutes mean 20 minutes until the end? Or, so is it time for our audience questions? After this. Oh, we get 20 more minutes.
We've been
Great.
reprieved.
Excellent. So here's another way of thinking about it. Why should we respect a belief that to at least some of us appears to have no basis? No basis in fact, even that is, it's a belief, it's a sincere, a deep belief. I certainly respect that.
But
That fact that it plays a role, but that doesn't involve respecting the content of the belief itself, unless there's something about the belief stripped of its theological trappings that's really important. So,
well, I would tend to agree with that. I'm not interested in any belief that's not based on fact. As I said before, I'm interested in evidence-based faith.
Right.
Now, there's a whole scientific side to me that reinforces this. I mean, the very fact that we can do science is evidence for me that there is a God. I believe that there's evidence there that is not, so to speak, dependent on a very sophisticated theological framework. I think there's real evidence for the existence of God. Otherwise, I wouldn't sit here for 2 minutes. Right. Because I share your view. I do not, in that sense, respect beliefs that have no evidence behind them. And that's the first question to ask of any belief. Why do you believe that? Right. On what evidence do you hold it? And if there's none, forget it.
And actually, most people, if we take it globe-wide, will not share this belief and will say, there's no evidence for it, there's not compelling evidence for it. Yes, I see some phenomena like this, but Actually, there's not adequate evidence. That's not just atheists. It's also agnostics.
Oh, it
It's
is.
people of other religious traditions, Islam, Confucianism, you name
You mean
it.
they're all belief systems?
There may all be belief systems, but they don't contain the belief content that
Oh,
your
yes, they
belief
do.
system.
Don't they?
Well,
I mean,
let's
forgive me.
see.
Naturalism. That's what Richard Dawkins, one of the
Right.
things he constantly says, atheists don't have faith. And that I find astonishing. When Peter Singer was, I debated Peter Singer, whom I'm sure you know.
Yes, I do.
And it was such an interesting conversation because he responded to me by saying, well, look, my biggest objection against religion is people that grew up in it stay in the same religion. And I'd told them about me, so I thought this is interesting. So when Peter came on, I said, Peter, I'm sure the audience would be interested in your parents. Were they atheists? And he said, yes, they were. So I said, and it was a very friendly discussion, let's not mistake that. I said, oh, so you remained in the same faith that you were brought up in? Oh, but he said it isn't a faith. I said, Peter, sorry, I was under the impression you believed it. Now, that little spat was very interesting to me because there has been a subtle redefinition of faith in our society. It's even crept into Webster's dictionary, but not into the Oxford Dictionary yet. And it goes like this: faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. So that's why I'm very happy to hear Peggy say, it's not only religious people that have faith, it's atheists and agnostics. Theirs is a belief system, and it's a positive belief system. That's the point that you were raising, because the negative atheist involves the positive philosophy of naturalism, which is a whole horde of beliefs. And I raise on my part the question, where's the evidence for the truth of these beliefs? So it actually works both ways.
Isn't there...
I'm skeptical in that direction, as you know.
Right. And we could quibble about what counts as naturalism. But let's move on.
Well, do
about,
quibble. I'm very happy for a philosopher to quibble.
Right.
Especially such a delightful one as you.
That's just because we want to have it both ways, right? Now, let's see, some other things that we could talk about. If anybody wants to interrupt with a question that we need, I know formal questions from the audience are coming, but if there's something that we need to take up right away. We are, however, losing our hold on suffering. So let's
get back
go back to suffering. Should we take another example or two? I know there was somebody with a hand up right over here that just got caught up. Yeah. Depression. Depression affects a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It makes your life horrific. Bad, yes. Right? And although we can identify the normal course of depression, we can identify onset and typically triggering causes. We know a lot about the natural course of depression. It's still bad, and it's still universal would be too strong a term.
But almost.
But it seems that way. Yeah. And so what about that as suffering? How do we think about the occurrence of suffering of this sort? It's a little bit like back pain. Well, actually, it's not quite like back pain because depression is more evident on the outside, at least to the trained eye. You see all of the sort of shutting down stuff that goes with depression. You can see when it starts to turn around. We worry about things like suicide and suicide attempts that normally occur just when someone is coming out of depression. So people in suicidology in therapy, clinical situations are very alert to that. So it can be fatal in that sense, but it can be life-damaging. What is the excuse for depression as a major factor, a major feature of human life? Why? Why would the God that we're describing, perfectly good, perfectly capable of designing human beings in any way that he might want, and knowing what depression is, why depression?
Well, I
This
think-
isn't some evil out there in the Philippines or in, Aztec times. This is right here in this room, right?
I think there are several levels of ways of approaching that. That's a very important question. I think the first thing that we need to do is take depression very seriously. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that in my little introduction, I made the point that as I see it, we wish ourselves out of existence if we ask God to create a world in which it is impossible to have bad things happen to good people, if you like, including depression. Some depressions are clinical. And one of the very important things in the kind of role I operate is to recognize where your competence ends. That some people with depression don't need talking to and comfort so much as they need certain medicines to bring back a balance in their brain. And that can help them marvelously. Other people need sympathy and talking to because their depression may result from a very bad decision or a broken relationship. This is a broken world. And I think the answer to your question, Peggy, is the same as I gave before, that the potential for that, however hard we find to accept it, I don't think God could have made humans any way he liked. Of course he could have made us robots, as I said, but robots, I'm glad I don't have a robotic wife, let me put it that way. If I arrived home and she was a robot and I pressed the iPad or whatever was here, kiss, and I get a robotic kiss, it would be meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. As Jean-Paul Sartre said years ago, and he's put it much better than me, he said, when we grasp a loved one, the last thing we want to be told is that their response is the response of an automaton. It has to be real. And I think it's inevitable that therefore these things can happen. Now, the question is, granted that they can and do happen, and it's perfectly consistent with at least the way I understand God to be, the next question is, what can we do about them? And let's do whatever we can. And thankfully, there are lots of things we can do at the very practical level.
But that part is true, but it doesn't answer the question of why design humanity so that depression afflicts it. To say that there's things we can do about depression, which indeed we should do and we ought to do, doesn't answer the basic question. We could not suffer from depression, and yet that would not make us automatons. Don't we know people who don't have depression? I know a couple. Not so many. I wish I knew more people who don't suffer from depression. Oh, they're not automatons.
There's
They're
no necessity to
human
suffer
beings.
from depression.
Well, then
but there's
why
the
is
possibility.
It here? Well, why?
Well,
is
I
it
think
here?
the answer lies in that. I think that's as far as I could go. I think the answer lies there. I mean, let me ask you the same question. Why do you think it is?
Well, why do I think depression is here? Well, I think there are certain chemical imbalances. There are certain social and environmental insults that occur. The biochemistry and physiology of depression is
But nothing
not
I've said
perfectly-
denies that. I agree with all of that.
No, but the question
But you're
is,
asking a deeper why, and I want your
That's
answer
right.
to the deeper why.
Yeah, the why I'd give you is that's the way human beings have evolved, right? What the function of depression is, I don't know. There are
But it
theories
leads
about
to the same
depression and
question.
creativity, but since we see examples of human beings who aren't subject to this suffering, if you can establish that the suffering leads to some important result that couldn't be achieved in any other way and is really important, then you have an excuse for the suffering.
Well, that's a very important point.
But we don't have. But remember, we're talking about the creative capacities of a God that's omnipotent, as well as omniscient. Now, we might not be able to redesign or even understand how you could redesign human beings so that they weren't depressed or didn't have episodes of depression, even though we see examples of people who aren't depressed and aren't subject to depression. But this God is supposed to be able to do anything, right?
But not the logically impossible. I mean,
That's
God
not
can't make a
logically
square
impossible.
circle.
Right? But not suffering from depression is not logically
Well,
impossible. We know that because there are humans who are not depressed.
Well, that is perfectly consistent with what I'm saying.
don't
There
see
is no necessity to be depressed, but if I make a
So-
series of wrong choices or my physiology gets out of balance and so on, I may well be depressed. This is a broken and fragmented world.
So why? Why?
Oh,
Why?
are you
Why?
asking the question?
Yeah.
Ah, I see.
Come
You're
on.
asking the question of where the Bible would begin to talk about a catastrophe that hit the world when sin entered the world. Is that what you're raising?
Well, are you
Because
trying to tell me that depression is a function of sin?
No.
No, okay.
Not a personal sin, but of the fracture of the world that was introduced by rebellion against God. I think that's perfectly possible. I mean, for instance, a child might grow up to be very depressive because of the sins of its parents, some awful things the parents did for which the child is not responsible.
Well, that might be the case, but we certainly don't want to assume that any case of depression
No,
is
of course
due to
we
the
don't. Of course we
sins of
don't.
the parent. Right?
And this was a point actually that Jesus was very emphatic about, because there was once a man that he saw was diseased and blind, and the common idea those days that if you were diseased or blind, you'd suffered in a previous life or something, you'd done something wrong. And they said, who did sin? He said, neither did this man sin nor his parents. You mustn't describe it to that. But I'd like to come back to
Yes,
what
and
I
we
think
have
was
5
the
minutes,
important
before...
seed was, can we see suffering do anything for people? In a limited sense, of course we can. You watch an athlete, they will suffer anything to win the 100 meters.
But it's elective.
Oh, it's selective, right. Absolutely. But
we're talking
now,
about
yes, let's take the next step.
Right.
That's the first level. The next level is what isn't elective but's bearable. Dostoevsky made the point, didn't he, that he could not imagine, and he'd never met, a person of real greatness of character who had not suffered somewhere. And the experience of life of suffering, surely even our own limited experience of it, increase our character and develop them. It's the extreme kind of suffering where people are wiped out en masse or brain tumours or all that kind of thing, where we see it as utterly senseless, that doesn't come into that category. It seems to be their graduation.
Well, and there's certainly kinds of suffering.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Yeah, that we can agree to, but we have to worry if we're exploring the theological view, the Christian view, we have to worry about the hardest kind as well as the easy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And,
but
and,
you
and
see,
I don't say that we have an answer yet.
Let me
John?
come round to this.
You've got an answer, and I've got a different answer.
Does
and
your
are we
reaction
meeting anywhere in between?
Does your reaction to this make you an atheist?
No,
it doesn't.
It doesn't. But it doesn't make me a theist either.
It doesn't make you a theist either.
Right?
So that, what is your rationale for morality, its existence, if God does not exist? Because what you're questioning my theistic view. So if you're questioning it, we must deny the antecedent to see what happens next.
So what might be the origin of human moral experience? Well, there are a variety of theories. One is the theological one. It trickles down from God, or it's infused in us by God. Another
hardwired.
Hardwired, right? It's more hardwired in some than others. So we're familiar with psychopaths, and we're also familiar with people who are what are known as altruists and what are known as conditional altruists. Conditional altruists are people who will act altruistically, but only if other people do. And genuine altruists, said to be quite rare, are people who will act altruistically on their own, regardless of the way other people act. Well, what's the explanation of these traits, right? Well, there are studies of the development of moral consciousness, moral sense, moral attitudes and capacities. Think of the work of Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan, developing stages of moral development that begin in early adolescence, tracking the capacity of people to think of themselves and the impact of doing various actions on themselves, and they are able to think about impact on a slightly larger social set. And at the top of this scale are people who are able to to conceive of their actions in terms of impact or importance for humanity. Now, that's you'd call it naturalistic account of the development of moral capacity. Kohlberg holds that not everybody gets all along the way, but it's an alternative to this. So it does not seem to me that you can't have morality if you don't have religion. The question about which comes first, morality or a religious conviction, is answered by Kant in this way, right? Well, look, you probably know the actual phrasing of it better than I do, but that the issue is something right because God wills it or commands it, or does God command it or will it because it's right? Right? So the view you're holding is that something is right because God wills it or commands it, I assume. Right? So God is the source of morality. But an equally plausible view, and I think the more correct view, is that if there is a God, just let us suppose there is, that what he would command would be what's antecedently right? That what's right predates
This is a late stage of the evening.
Hey, and we have 1 minute, right?
To raise the Euthyphro problem, because that's what you're raising.
And it's a serious problem in the history of philosophy.
It is a serious problem, but my response to it, which has got to be in 10 seconds, and it'll be absolutely inadequate, is to say God commands it because it's right, but that doesn't mean that God could command anything and therefore make it right. Because rightness is an expression of the essential character of God. And I think the Euthyphro problem arises from not taking that into account.
Antecedent to God or independent of God. Hey, you know what? We got to the point where you get to talk. Isn't that right?
Yes, we get the questions now.
All right. That's great. Here comes Beth. Oh, look at this. They're divided up. I think you get the yellow ones and I get the blue ones. Is that it? Hey, you want to trade?
Sure.
I will say that was too short. I look forward to hearing more from you.
It's what? Can I try one? Tonight's discussion is great for adults, but how do I address suffering to an 8-year-old who is suffering? Good question. What do you say to your 8-year-old who has, it might be rejection or somebody has betrayed him in some way, or it might be an illness of some sort. So any of the kinds of suffering that we could think about, maybe this 8-year-old and you live in a war-torn area and there's, anything. How do you address suffering to an 8-year-old? This is a question for you, John. Take it.
I'm a grandfather.
And I'm a grandmother. Here,
and you're a grandmother, so it's a question for both of us.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to start off it?
What do you say? You say, "Oh, sweetheart, I am so sorry. This is so unfair that this happens to you. We'll try to make the best of it. Let's look on whatever positive features might come from this, even if it's expressions of sympathy from others. We try to relieve your suffering in any way we can, but I'm really sorry that this is happening to you." End of story. I'm not going to say, "Oh, well, you're going to be rewarded in the afterlife for this suffering. You're 8 years old now, and your life expectancy is another, 78 years or something, and you'll get your reward eventually." How can you say that to an 8-year-old? How can you make that plausible? Can't do it. You have to acknowledge, I think you have to acknowledge suffering, depending on what kind of suffering it is, as something unfair, as something to be made the best of, but that doesn't make it fair.
It's amazing how some children, just yesterday, or was it the day before, I was speaking at a large conference, and a man bought one of my books, and he came up with his boy, and the boy was about 7. And he said, "Will you shake hands with my son?" I said, "I'd love to. It's lovely to see children here." He said, "He's got cancer." And you know, my heart just, lovely little boy, and he shook my hand, and he was so warm. And I looked at his dad, and I thought, you must be a wonderful dad to deal with this and give that child the warmth so that he can smile and he can talk to me quite normally. So things can be done. And I think Peggy's absolutely right. I just had one little thing, which she'll expect me to do anyway. I think heaven, you might be surprised to hear a professor say this, is very real and can be very real to children. And they need the comfort. To just talk to them about a reward in heaven would be nonsense. But for a long-term suffering child, to be told that there will be release and there will be a world without pain and without suffering, that's a magnificent thing to be able to say to anybody. And I've had to do it.
And it
My
would be
niece...
great if you could be sure it were true.
Yes, you can be. I believe that.
There we go. See,
Otherwise, I
there's
wouldn't
the
sit
great-
here.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But it's a lovely question to ask, but you must realize, of course, the questioner must realize that we were asked to speak at a meeting for adults. We'd speak very differently if we were addressing 8-year-olds.
Yeah.
Shall I take one now, or do you want to say some more?
No, it's your turn. Oh, I've got great ones, so...
Oh, you've got good ones.
Yeah.
Can I have them? Right. Well, I'm going to place these in an order. Your parental analogy for the allowance of evil can account for moral evil, but how do you account for natural evil? That's a very perceptive question, because the analogy doesn't relate to it at all. And I was really faced with this on my way to New Zealand, because I knew I was doing a lecture series, and I had to change every lecture, every TV interview, every radio interview, because it was why earthquakes. And this is a very complex question. Why the typhoon in the Philippines? It's a separate question from the suffering of the people. Let me put it this way. Earthquakes. What are earthquakes? Well, they're the shifting of tectonic plates. They are utterly essential for the existence of human life, of any kind of life. Now, here is the oddest paradox that you face. Let's just forget the suffering for a moment. Earthquakes have been proved to be, in this fascinating book, and I read one just a month before the earthquake in New Zealand, they're essential for life. And yet...
Because why?
Because of the way they break up the oceans, and it's to do with the constitution of the atmosphere and so on. There's masses of science in this. Okay. There's no question about it. And yet they kill. They kill, of course, if people build their houses on fault lines. The earthquake isn't, in that sense, evil. Calling it natural evil is slightly misleading. The better, perhaps, is the phrase you use, the problem of pain. Natural evil, pain, okay, it's fine. But that's the problem. The earthquake was simply doing its thing. The shifting of the tectonic plates is doing its thing. The pity is that someone is above it. And now you get the philosophical question. Could God create fire that doesn't burn but warmed you? Could he create a world that isn't dangerous in some sense?
Could he?
And in a sense, I don't think we'll ever get behind that, because what we have to cope with is not the philosophical question of what God could, might, or would have done. It's as we face the mixed picture we see in the world, is there any reason to trust God with an ultimate answer? I think that's the only question we can begin to answer. We can't answer the other question. And it was very interesting that I found in New Zealand that approaching it that way, somehow, and I didn't quite know why, somehow saying that, and then pointing out that our world at all of its levels shows that sort of thing you see when you go into Coventry Cathedral in England. You see the traces of a past beauty, but you see that a bomb has hit it. And there is a sense in which a bomb has hit our planet. Because from the biblical perspective, and this is a huge topic, but from the biblical perspective, the rebellion of human beings against God has had effects on the planet. But even apart from that altogether, it seems to me that we rest in front of a question we simply cannot answer. Earthquakes are vital. You wouldn't exist without them.
Oh, but
And
couldn't
yet-
the Earth have been designed without
Well,
them?
I know you would raise that question, but I raised it for you, and I said I can't answer it.
I think this is important. They're all important, but this one. Where can we look for hope or justice apart from where can we look for hope or justice apart from an eternal existence or an ultimate judge? So there are two questions in here. One's about hope and one's about justice. But I think that the point of, let's just talk about justice. We did talk about hope earlier. One of the questions that came in antecedently to us was that Utah students in particular were asking the question, why is life unfair? So I'm understanding unfair in a number of senses, that there isn't justice that might be adequate judicial procedure. There might not be recompense for what's lost. There are gross income inequalities. There are disparities in aptitudes and resources. We see a pattern of maldistribution of many things that are tremendously life effective. Well, where can we look for hope of justice? Not up there, I don't think. But here, if there's going to be a more just situation on this earth, we have to make it that way. Now, we might appeal to an ideal of a just God and what justice would look like in the abstract, and that appeal might be very powerful. It might look much more like the Paradiso in Dante's depiction of it. Everybody gets a seat. Some are a little further out on the rim, but not too much. Everybody's included. That's not the picture of our world. The picture of our world is one of shocking disparities in life circumstances. But much of that has been created by us. It's what we need to fix. So whether we think about it in terms of a divine model or what, I think to hope that there will be justice in some afterlife is to undercut the sense that we should have and must have of our own responsibility for changing circumstances.
You know, in your question there, God did create a world, a perfect world. He designed that anatomy without suffering, without decay, without cancer, without disease, without depression. It was humanity that chose to rebel against God and sin, which then created suffering, and then that came into the world, and we started decaying. But also, where's God in that suffering? God took what man did to rebel against me. And in suffering, he provided his son Jesus that took upon him all the sins of you and all of us here. His son took on the sins and the suffering of the whole world. And he died. He died like the jihadists. He died like all these people that you mentioned. But there's one thing different. Those people did it for virgins and for themselves and self-pride. But Jesus did it for us. And then he was raised. After 3 days, he was raised from the dead, where these others weren't. So the solution is, and the hope for this child that is dying, etc. That's the hope, and he overcame death for each one of us.
Yeah. So that's an answer that will appeal here. It isn't an answer that I hear. The evident fact. I would agree that much of the suffering that's in the world is created by humans, whether it's the product of sin. What antecedent your story, a story you give about how it got started, is maybe not as relevant in this sense as what can we do about it. I think that the hope of justice displaced to an afterlife is unfortunate. Wait, so do we have time? 1 minute. Yeah.
Have we just 1 minute left?
2 minutes.
Oh, shall
I've got one more after this,
Yeah,
right?
let's probably do one more
I've got
question.
2 more.
One more question.
One more question.
And there are many out there, I bet.
Oh gosh, well, one of mine was the same as yours.
Really?
And I'd like to emphasize that I agree with Peggy that we must work to eliminate suffering as much as we can and see justice in this world. But I disagree profoundly with her that believing in an ultimate justice undercuts it. To my mind, it increases its strength phenomenally, because it means that my moral sense of justice now has got a backup.
I'd agree with you in this sense that the picture of ultimate justice in an afterlife or in a divine context can be a very powerful motivator.
But to help us to seek for justice here,
there. What?
It was Christians that got rid of slavery after all, not atheists.
Right. They got rid of gladiator shows also.
Yes.
Right. Did
So,
a lot of good. Of course, they
do you
few
want to do
other
your last
things.
question first?
Oh, you do yours.
I do mine, okay.
Okay.
If there's so much proof
Okay.
for Christianity, why are so many people not Christians? Well, my response to that is that God is not a theory but a person. And our response, therefore, to God is a holistic response as persons. It doesn't simply involve, though it does involve, assent to an intellectual proposition of the existence of God. It involves a step of commitment and trust in something very specific. It involves a moral change of mind, which is called metanoia in Greek, to change your mind, to repent. And therefore, it brings in a whole ethical and moral dimension. And when you say, why aren't so many people Christians? My experience is simply this, that when the moral thing begins to kick in, when people begin to realize that becoming a Christian is not just accepting some kind of a theory, but it means an utterly radical change of life, and it means repenting of all the mess we've made of life and committing ourselves to a personal Saviour, Christ, who's died and risen again, and following him. For many people, as they rightly count that cost, they say, no, I'm not prepared to go with that. So that's one of the reasons that I would say it involves much more than simply an intellectual response to a set of facts. There is a commitment, and some people don't want that. And God, and this is one of my evidences that Christianity is true, God doesn't force them. He accepts their decision. Because the one thing you cannot do is force love on people. That's a meaningless thing. It's got to be a two-way response. So that would be my very brief response to that question. But let Peggy do the last one.
Tonight has focused on suffering. How does beauty, joy, and so forth, what about those things? Can we have these without suffering? Well, I think the answer is clearly yes. And it depends on where we look. So let's look right here. Now, is there beauty here? Well, yeah, there's a certain beauty and joy even in this collection of people on this occasion. If you look at what we are doing, right? What are we doing? We are sitting, talking together about the biggest questions, and it's clear that there is not perfect agreement. There's disagreement about some of the biggest issues, but there's also a sense of, I think, cooperation in exploring this, about respect for each other, about engagement of everybody in this room. I wish everybody had time to talk and participate in this, in concern for whatever suffering is going out there. That's actually a kind of beauty, in a way. We're not out slaughtering each other because our religious convictions might be different. A couple hundred years ago, we might have been, right? Or if we were in Northern Ireland, we might have been, right?
We've no atheists there.
Well, I'm not.
Oh, yes, we have.
You never established that I was an atheist,
no,
which
I didn't.
I'm not exactly.
I was going to say we've two kinds of atheists in Northern Ireland, Protestant ones and Catholic ones.
All right, there we go. Anyway, what's happening here is wonderful, and I think we need to thank Veritas for assembling an occasion like this and to see disagreement, but also mutual approach, I think is quite wonderful.
It's wonderful.
So thank you for being here. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Lennox. Thank you, Dr. Battin.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
I will take this.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.